Fantastic conference. Can we have some slides? Okay. So I like to start the morning with a little bit of classical music. And I've done this before, but I really enjoy thinking about what this music represents. So this piece of music was actually written in 1500s or so. And it was performed in the Vatican for about 150 years. But it was never played out or never sung outside the Vatican. It was only ever sung by the choir of the Sistine Chapel. And the manuscript was kept under lock and key, and the choir was kind of committed to secrecy. And then let there be light. Can we have the lights off again? Anyway, the point is that there was maybe 150 years after the piece of music was written, a young boy went to the chapel and heard the music and was so kind of inspired by what he heard, went home that evening and wrote the music down from memory and committed it to manuscript and took it to London and then published it so that the rest of the world could hear this beautiful piece of music. And to me, that's kind of like the act of open sourcing. You take what is, ultimately a very proprietary piece of closed source intellectual property, and you try to break it free. You try to make sure that the rest of the world can enjoy using it, or listening to it, in this case, as much as possible. So, of course, the boy was Mozart. Not everybody is able to write down incredible pieces of music like this from memory and try and inscribe them. But, that story kind of inspires me, and it inspires us at Facebook. Because when we're thinking about all the technology that we've created inside the company that we use ourselves, we think about how can we, set that free and get it out into the outside world. So, enough of that. It reminds me that being open always kind of trumps being closed. And it reminds me that, being connected always trumps being isolated, and also that sharing trumps secrecy. Ultimately, we as a company have a vision to try and make the world more open and connected, and that applies to our work in software and our work with developer communities. So obviously, we take open source very seriously at Facebook. We have over 200 projects, all of them, no, not all of them, but nearly all of them are on GitHub. We have over 10 million lines of code. And we have about 120,000 followers cumulative across those projects. So, large numbers of engineers and developers outside the company hopefully get to benefit from what we do. And 20,000 forks. So we think that, people are actually using some of this stuff. But we don't also open source software. I mean, we do open source, our web infrastructure, our front-end JavaScript libraries. We open source our mobile frameworks and mobile tools. And big data infrastructure also is something we're well known for. But we also open source our hardware. So if any of you have heard of the Open Compute project, we've open sourced the designs and the schematics and the firmware for our servers, for our networking hardware, and even our data centers. So, we take it, the open source concept very, very literally all the way down to the bottom of the stack. And in fact, I'm sure many of you are aware, we actually open sourced the designs and schematics to the Oculus virtual reality goggles a couple of weeks ago. So, it kind of pervades the company culture, as I think it should. Because it's always been part of our culture. From the very first day that Mark Zuckerberg sat down and started building a website to help connect his college friends, we've been using open source. So he used Linux and Apache and MySQL and PHP. Bad choice in retrospect, but he picked PHP and build a website. I mean, pretty much that was all he had to choose from at the time. Remember, this was 2004, kid in his bedroom wanted to get started as quickly as possible. So open source made Facebook possible from the very, very, very first day. Now, of course, we're much larger now. We have many, many more engineers. Mark himself does not do any coding anymore. He's busy learning Chinese or whatever it is he does these days. And we're obviously much more able to contribute the work that we do back out to the community. And we feel we have an obligation to, because we're obviously founded on open source from the very, very start. And I think that cycle is really important. I mean, we, take open source to use as much as we can. There's no point reinventing the wheel. So we'll start with projects that we think fill our needs. We obviously scale them. Facebook is a company that operates at some kind of scale, so often we'll find that those projects aren't designed to operate with quite as many zeros as we throw at them. So we often have to scale these projects and sometimes improve them as a result. because, yeah, like I said, they're not always designed to do that, and we have to kind of enhance them. Sometimes we have to replace the open source project that we've started using in order to kind of break through that scaling challenge. But we always make sure that we release back what we have done as a result. And then continue to use it. I think this is very important, the fact that this is a cycle. You know, there are companies I know who claim to do open source, but in fact, when you look at their projects, they are summer intern vanity projects, you know, little things that are thrown out there. No, what we open source is the infrastructure that we actually use. So when Wikipedia uses HHVM, our web server, it is exactly the same code that we use. When other companies are using web-scale SQL, that's exactly the version of MySQL that we're using. When people are using React, whether it's, you know, the Khan Academy or GitHub even are using React, you know, that's the same version of the React library that we're using. So that cycle helps us to make sure that the software gets maintained, keeps being maintained, and people can use it with the confidence that it's been kind of production battle tested. Of course, it hasn't always been that way, but we'll come to that in a moment. So it's not only that open source is a kind of a key part of our technology stack, it's also part of our culture, and it's a strong way to kind of get our engineering teams to be efficient as possible. And in fact, we did a survey of some of our new engineers recently that had joined the company. And we asked them how many of them had been aware of our open source project before they joined the company. And something like 2/3 of them said they had been, so that's great. But more importantly, about half of those people, so 1/3 of all new engineering staff at Facebook, said that the open source program and our efforts in open source had positively contributed to their decision to join the company. So, you know, in terms of helping to attract the best quality talent and, you know, get our story out about the sort of challenges that we're facing, open source has obviously been fantastic. What's more, when those people join the company and start using the technology that they've been using outside of the company, it means they can ramp up and become effective much, much more quickly. And when you look at the Silicon Valley salary of an engineer, and you notice that you can now get them to be productive within 2 weeks instead of within 6 months, because they're already familiar with your stack, you know, that's a huge win. But here's the thing that people often forget about open source, and this very much applies to us too. You know, open source is a chance for you to kind of open the windows on what you're doing, on your technology, and it actually means we do a better job. So we're a bit cropped there, but open source, this is a quote from one of my colleagues, open source is like the breeze from an open window. By opening up our code and our infrastructure to the world, we're giving people a chance to see what we do. We're getting them, obviously, to get their eyeballs on the code, so we make sure we, you know, comment it and document it well and so forth. But it means that we're having to justify our architectural decisions. It means we're having to modularize our infrastructure really, really well, because we're going to open source some bits but not others. And so, you know, we really think carefully about those boundaries. It keeps our internal APIs clean, and it just means we do a better job. So, you know, that's just a small selection of some of the benefits that we're getting on the engineering side. But of course, hasn't always been this way, and I'm sure many of you that have been following Facebook and our open source efforts will know we haven't always been quite as good at this. And in fact, just a year ago, if you'd had a look at our GitHub account, you would have found some interesting things. So 3.20 was a fairly well-known iOS library that we open sourced about 5 years ago. But if you'd looked at the README, you'd have seen this. Support of 3.20 has been discontinued. I mean, it had thousands of followers, and yet we decided to turn it off. Our PHP SDK deprecated. And our fork of Memcache, which we use extensively. You know, the description for this project is test. The last commits were 6 and 7 years ago, respectively. So, you know, there were lots and lots of projects that we had out on our GitHub account that just weren't being maintained, weren't being used, and obviously the community kind of resented us for it, right? And the problem is this, of course, the classic problem of throwing a project over the wall and thinking that it'll just go on and be successful all on its own. You know, I know many, many companies have fallen into this trap, and we were absolutely no exception. But the problem is that if you throw something over the wall and don't care about it, it's worse than not having done anything at all. You may as well not have open sourced it in the first place. It actually becomes counterproductive to throw things over that people start to trust and think they can use, and then realize that you're going to pull the rug out from underneath. So anyway, about a year ago, we decided to reboot things, get our house in order. At that time, we didn't even have an open source team. It was just being kind of done in a random kind of way. So we got a team together, a very, very small team, and started to see whether we could get the overall program back in shape. First thing we needed to do is find out what we owned, what we had, what was out there, and the good news was it was all on GitHub, so we just had to look through there and try to figure out which projects were doing well and which projects were doing badly, for some definition of well and badly when applied to open source projects. Well, the good news is, of course, that GitHub has an API, which allowed us to basically scrape all of our projects, pull all the metadata, the pull requests, the issues, the commits, how many commits were coming from external contributors versus internal contributors, etc., etc., and basically scrape this and put it into a database. Now, it turns out we have some database capacity at Facebook, so we store this, and basically we have all of this metadata for every repo, every commit, every pull request, and every issue. And because it's all sitting in a database table, makes it really easy for somebody, me in this case, to find out what we have, see what projects are doing well, which have the most followers, which have the most forks, which ones are alive, and which ones are dead, for some definition of alive and dead. And, I love GitHub. It's fantastic. It's got a really nice user interface. Hello, Chris. But sometimes it's just easier to use SQL to find out what the heck is going on when you've got 200 projects. Quickly we found some kind of, oh, wait a minute, there's some strange stuff going on here. So I don't know if you've noticed, there's a project here called Animation, which has 0 followers, 0 forks, 0 commits, and 0 pull requests. Well, oh, wait a minute, this is a rather strange project for us to put out. It does have one issue. I'm going to guess that issue is, where's the code? And I have absolutely no idea to this day what this project is or was intended to be, because there are 0 lines of code. That's the sort of thing that kind of reflects badly on us as an organization. So we killed that one. And we started to focus on the ones that we could see were doing well and that had vibrant and healthy communities behind them. Now, of course, once you're scraping data like this, we did this as a one-off audit, once you're scraping data like this, you may as well start doing it more and more regularly and start building up a story over time of how these projects are evolving. So one of the things we do is track the number of GitHub watches we have across the whole portfolio. And this is our data going from February to April this year, rising from whatever that is, 80,000 up to about 105,000. And this is fascinating because now as someone responsible for looking at the whole program, I can start to see, well, what are we doing well? What is causing a rise in interest in our projects? And in this case, we launched 2 iOS projects. This one, I think, was Shimmer. This one was one called Tweaks. And those projects kind of led to a huge growth in followers. Not that followers are the one thing we should be optimizing for at all, but it does give you a sign that, okay, something is resonating with the community. We're obviously doing something right here. So we now track about 35 different metrics for all of our GitHub repos, ranging from, well, all the things I've mentioned to some really kind of obscure things that are only relevant to 1 or 2 teams. But we've settled on 5, which we really consider to be our kind of top-level metrics that we use to judge the health of the program and project individually. So the number of average followers per repo, the average forks per repo, the average pull request age, and the average issue age. Now, the reason that we track the age for these things rather than the number is that actually the number of pull requests is a sign of health, right? If there are lots of people submitting changes and lots of people reporting issues, that's a good thing. But if they are very old and stale and not being addressed, then that is a very bad thing. So we're optimizing for to try to reduce the age of those as much as possible. Because I don't know about you, but when I go to a GitHub project to decide whether to use it in one of my own things, the first thing I do is look to see, well, how many open bugs are there, or how many pull requests have been left unaddressed. Does the community or does the owner of this project perhaps give a damn? And you can quickly tell just by looking at the numbers that they don't. So we very much make an effort to keep those down. The final one, which is very important for us, is the number of external commits. We obviously are using all of this software, so we ourselves are making lots and lots of contributions to them. But we also, feel so great when the community starts contributing stuff back. So we track very, very specifically, the ratio of Facebook employees to non-Facebook employees that are contributing to each and every project. And that actually is an interesting signal for when a project has kind of matured and maybe is ready to leave the nest and go off and become a community project all on its own rather than a Facebook one, at the point at which there are now more contributors externally than internally. Talk about that in a bit. We have an intranet site where we basically make all of the graphs and stats available. So anyone in the company, actually any engineer or anyone in management, or Mark, I don't know if he's ever been there, but he can go and look and see how we're doing on all these metrics. But the point is, I think, about reporting and using data really, really rigorously in an open source project, an open source program like this, is that it kind of shows you're doing a good job, it shows you care, it kind of sends a meta message that you're trying to do the whole program with discipline. Something we found that's been really, really important is ownership. So we have, as I said, 210 projects or something at this point. It's very difficult for me to keep my head on top of all of the projects that are out there and all of the different teams that are working on them, or in fact what even all of these projects do. So one thing we've worked hard to do is establish for every single project like a named employee who is responsible for that. Now obviously many of them have more than just one individual. There may be a team behind that is working on the project. But knowing who the point of contact is absolutely vital. We found out that those that had gone stale were very, almost always those ones where the employee had left the company and had, of course, drifted off and forgotten all about the project, and it was just left there, kind of dirtying our portfolio. So we actually have a little tool where we can spot which employees have left the company and where we have to kind of run around quickly and figure out who should now take on that project. Or if there are no more employees or no more teams that want to own that particular thing, then we might look at handing it off to the community. And in fact, that's what we did in the case of Tornado. When the individual responsible left the company, we actually donated it out to one of the original authors who had since left. So we have a little internal tool. It's kind of a cool trick. We tried to bind the internal Facebook employee identity to the GitHub identity when they first join the company. We would send them through a little OAuth flow, which then means that for every commit we see on GitHub, we know whether it was an employee or not. And obviously that makes it very easy for us to keep track of how these things are doing. And this is one, let me see, that looks like React. So React is a project that we feel is kind of reaching a tipping point. It's a JavaScript library. We're very, very proud of it. But here's a pie chart at the bottom. This is just, again, a screenshot from our intranet where you can see the mix of Facebook commits versus non-Facebook commits. We're getting some really fantastic contributions to React from Khan Academy and more. And so being able to kind of see that pie chart grow over time is a really kind of fantastic thing, and it gives us a clue that, well, okay, maybe this thing is bigger than us at this point, and we'll maybe hand it off and think about what to do with it in the future. So you'll notice that I'm very data-driven, and I use this as a way to kind of keep the program very disciplined. One of the nice side effects of this is that it gamifies the whole thing within the company. So I don't manage any of these teams, right? They're all individual engineering teams scattered all over the company, and I have no kind of management authority over them. So how do I get them to do what I want? Well, one of the things is to show them graphs and kind of report the data up to management and so forth, and they begin to realize that this is important stuff. But the other thing I can do is kind of gamify it and get the teams to play off each other. And a fantastic example actually happened yesterday. So this is hot off the press. So HHVM, which is our PHP runtime, it is our web server, is open source, has been for 2 or 3 years. And React is another project that we open sourced only about 1.5 years ago, but has been doing extremely well. It's a JavaScript framework. And the stars must have aligned, or literally the stars aligned, because yesterday both of them were sitting at about 9,900 stars on GitHub each. I was like, okay, now this could be interesting. So I put out a tweet saying, which of our 2 projects is going to reach 10,000 followers first? I told each of the teams, well, you're both within a shout of 10,000 followers. Which of you is going to get 10,000 followers first? And so, the teams were like refreshing their GitHub pages relentlessly, trying to see like who's going to get there, who's going to get there. And I think, HHVM was about 20 to go, and React was about 80 to go, so it was like quite a long way behind. Unfortunately, React has a really popular Twitter account. So they went onto Twitter and they said, hey, right, guys, why don't you go and star us? And they shot past, and with about 10 to go, they managed to overtake HHVM in the closing moment. But, the meta point of this is that these teams are really kind of focused on this. Again, we're not optimizing for the number of stars, but it's an example of the sort of things that they know they are being judged on, and they know that the company is holding them to. And I can't say how proud I am, by the way, that we had 2 projects that have both kind of now broken through that 10K kind of threshold, and coincidentally both on the same day. So anyway, that was quite amazing. We also use the metrics to kind of clean up the community debt that we have. I mentioned average pull request days, and this is our rather poor record. About a year ago, we had almost a year old. The average pull request on a GitHub project for a Facebook project was 348 days or something. That is pretty embarrassing. If you consider all the pull requests that were created in the last few days, and you know how averages work, that must mean there are some that are 3 or 4 years old, and in fact there were. So we had some really, really tragic cases of people, like communities, community members donating these fantastic pull requests that had just sat unattended for 3-4 years. It was just deeply embarrassing. So anyway, we used, again, data to kind of clean our house up, and you can see these big drops where a particular team has maybe done a bug bash or a pull request kind of triage night or whatever, and they've kind of really worked hard on an individual project, and with a few step changes, but also with some organic discipline, you can see we've actually got right down to about 4 months, which is still kind of a long time for a piece of software to sit unreviewed, waiting for attention, but still a lot better than a year. So we're kind of proud of that too. But that gets us thinking about, well, what is the community health around these projects, and like what is the destiny for these different projects? So we think a lot about the growth, how to get them adopted, how to get them used, how to make sure communities are excited about our projects. But like, what is going to happen to these things in the long term? Because no open source project is perpetual by definition, and we always try to think about what is going to happen to each and every one of our projects, and how we're going to make sure that they go on to their natural homes. Sometimes we release things that are literally just a snapshot of software, and so we know that they are just kind of a read-only one-shot. Sometimes we do academic publications and we open source the code that goes with them so people can reproduce them. So sometimes we know it's just going to be a frozen statement in time. Other times we will have forked something, or we will have adapted something dramatically enough that we've had to work on it independently, and we will have a stated goal to try to upstream it back to the original project. That's relatively hard, of course, if only because we are often working at a different speed. We're pushing code to Facebook.com twice a day. We're often working at a different speed to the upstream project, which has obviously got more stakeholders involved. So that upstreaming and merging is kind of a hard thing, but we've done that in a couple of cases recently, so it can be done. Fly the nest is an interesting one, which is when a project reaches that community tipping point where it's no longer that obvious that it's an exclusive Facebook project anymore. How do we manage that handover? We don't want to like sending your toddler off to university. We don't want to put a project out prematurely to the community because we think it'll probably fall flat on its face. But at the point you can see it has enough community momentum to keep itself going, like how do we gracefully hand it off to the community or to a foundation or to some other organization? And that's actually a process that we haven't quite figured out, but we're gonna have to figure it out very, very soon. And more of that in a moment. Sometimes we explicitly deprecate projects. I don't think enough open source projects do this. You declare mission accomplished. You say, this does what it set out to do. It is no longer needed. Done. And we are very ruthless about this. If there's something that we just think doesn't fill a need in the marketplace anymore, or solves a problem that has passed, we're more than happy to deprecate it, archive it, put it out there, obviously leave it on our archive account, but make it very, very clear that it is not intended for production use anymore. And then finally, if something gets kind of, goes off the rails, perhaps a project doesn't go as well as we thought it would, and it gets into a sort of a horrible situation, there's always the opportunity to kind of reboot it and start again. And we've in fact done that with Thrift, which was a project that we open sourced. We forked it. We got into a situation when we couldn't merge it with the upstream one, and we re-open sourced the fork. Now that we've done that, we are in a much better place to merge it back upstream. But we're not ashamed to say sometimes we're just going to have to try again, reboot the program, reboot the project. So, look, I could talk all day about this stuff. I mean, it's my life, and I love doing it, and we have a whole load of exciting projects. And in fact, I do often talk about it a lot, and various other occasions. And what often happens is that people will come up to me, after a session like this, and they'll say, you know what, this is amazing. You have exactly the same kind of problems that we've had, and we've come up with a different solution, or maybe a similar solution, and isn't it insane that we've all kind of had to invent these techniques and these approaches independently? Because running open source at a company is kind of an interesting challenge, especially when you've got a large portfolio. So, I go to conferences and I meet with my friends from Box or Dropbox or GitHub or Google or Khan Academy Square, Stripe, Twitter, Walmart, whoever, and then they all say, why don't we stop reinventing the wheel? Why don't we get together and share our experiences of running open source programs like this? It doesn't scale doing it independently, and we're all companies that care deeply about scaling, so why don't we pool our efforts, pool our experiences, and start to see whether we can be more efficient about running these programs? When I started doing this a year ago, I had no idea how to do this, right? I had no idea how to run an open source program. I've had to find out through trial and error, and it seems insane that there wasn't a nice guidebook that would tell me how to do this. So we got together, the companies on that slide, we got together and we formed, at first, a relatively informal group, which is called To Do. And we came up with the name and the logo, actually, before we even figured out what it should stand for, but the backronym is Talk Openly, Develop Openly. So the idea is that it's a group of people like me, people like you, that work in companies doing open source, and it's a forum for us to come together and talk about the way that we run our programs and the things that we've learned, what works well and what does not work well. To be absolutely clear, this is not a Facebook initiative by any means. We are just one of 12 members at this point. 13 members, actually. We're very, very keen to contribute what we've learned, but also to learn back and to share as much as possible amongst the other members and the broader community. In fact, since we've launched, we've also had representatives from IBM and Yahoo and Microsoft join, so that's been fantastic. And the sorts of things that we're thinking about as a group are many of the things that I've alluded to already in this presentation, but what are the challenges that companies like us face? Why run an open source program in the first place? It's been very easy for us to justify doing it, but I know in some companies it's not so easy to even justify. What are the policies for launching new projects? Like, how do you use external projects? How should you let employees work on their own time? The perpetual challenges of licenses and CLAs and so forth, how to interact well with communities, how to manage large portfolios using data and tools, what are the metrics that help measure success of a project, what is the open source project lifecycle, to my earlier points, how do you merge open source identities and employee identities for your engineers, and how do you even manage things which apparently should be very simple to answer, like where is the source of truth for your code? Is it an internal repo that's the source of truth, or is it the open source version of the repo that's the source of truth? You might think that's a very simple question, has a very complicated answer. So, these are all questions that I've had to try to figure out the answer to. I still haven't got the answer to all of them, and I know that my colleagues are the same. So what we hope to do is, over the coming weeks and months, is start basically spool up series of conversations on each of these topics. We'll be running blog posts written by the different members of the groups and by guest authors, and really try to get that conversation going. Because I'm sure there is a lot of prior art out there, but it's not always been shared, and so we're really trying to get that out there. And who knows, maybe even at some point we can start to think about the tooling that might be required to make this job easier. So we're all super excited about To Do, and if you are in a company running an open source program and you would love to find out more, we're actually going to have a lunchtime session here, and it is in room 301A, I believe, at lunchtime. So Chris from GitHub and Will from Google and myself we're all here, and we'd love to meet you and just have an open mic session, really. Hi, I'm James from Facebook. I run open source. These are my problems. Open source anonymous, there we go. And we're basically, really, really keen to hear the kind of problems that everyone else is having and see whether we can prioritize the sorts of things that the group as a whole could work on. We believe that companies can be responsible users, curators and donators of open source projects, and we really want to make sure we can move the open source world in general forwards. So thank you. That's about it. I'd just like to conclude by saying, Facebook takes open source very, very seriously. It's been, an honor to share a little bit of our journey with you. Unlike Mozart, who had to wait 150 years, we only have to wait until lunchtime to get a chance to talk about what we've been doing. And together with the other members of To Do, I hope we can all help make the open source world a better place. Thanks very much.